What would you do if, one morning, you stepped outside your home only to realize you were being watched? Not by a stranger, but by your own HOA. Cameras, discreetly installed overnight, now monitored every move, every glance, every step. At first, it seemed like a simple security measure, but something felt off. Too many angles, too much coverage, almost invasive. And that was just the beginning. I never thought I'd be the type of person to go up against my own HOA, but here I was, right in the middle of a battle I never signed up for. At first, the new security cameras seemed harmless, just another rule buried in the never-ending list of HOA regulations. They claimed it was for community safety, a standard measure to prevent crime. I barely gave it a second thought, until I realized where those cameras were pointing. Not just at public spaces or entry points, but at private driveways, personal patios, and front doors. My own home was under surveillance, every moment recorded without my consent. It wasn't just security anymore. It was an invasion of privacy. I reached out to the HOA expecting a reasonable discussion. Instead, I got condescending reassurances, vague excuses, and outright dismissal. That's when the frustration kicked in. If they thought I'd just accept this violation of privacy, they were wrong. I was about to fight back, and they wouldn't see it coming. When the HOA first announced the installation of security cameras, I barely paid attention. The email was buried between reminders about lawn maintenance and parking restrictions, just another rule in the long list of things they like to micromanage. For community safety, they claimed. I shrugged it off, figuring a few extra cameras in shared spaces wouldn't hurt. After all, security was a good thing, right? But then, something didn't sit right. A few days later, as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed the first one, small, discreet, positioned on the street lamp across from my house. Then another mounted just above the community mailboxes. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the more I looked, the clearer it became. These cameras weren't just covering entrances and common areas. They were angled directly at individual homes, mine included. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't just about preventing crime. This was surveillance. Plain and simple, I decided to test my theory. Over the next few days, I paid closer attention. Each time I left my house, I glanced at the cameras. They were strategically placed. One had a perfect view of my front door, another captured every movement in my driveway. Even my living room windows weren't completely safe. I started to feel paranoid, like I was living in some dystopian neighborhood experiment where privacy no longer existed. I brought it up casually with a neighbor, hoping I was just overthinking things. "Yeah, I noticed them too," he admitted, lowering his voice. "They didn't even tell us where they were putting them. Just woke up one day, and there they were." That's when it hit me. The HOA hadn't just installed security cameras. They had done it without informing homeowners of their exact locations or how much they were actually monitoring. I decided to reach out to the HOA, expecting at least some level of transparency. I sent an email first, phrasing my concerns carefully, polite, professional, non-confrontational. The response? A generic statement about safety and compliance with community policies. No specifics, no explanations. Just a brush off. That's when I took it a step further. I attended the next HOA meeting, hoping for a real conversation. Enter the HOA president, Mr. Carter, a man who thrived on control, who treated the community like his personal kingdom. When I brought up the issue, he barely looked up from his notes. "The cameras are for security," he repeated, as if that answered everything. When I pushed for details, who had access to the footage, where exactly they were placed, his patience thinned. "If you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't be worried." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just overreach. It was a power play, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I wasn't the type to stir up trouble, but this wasn't something I could ignore. The idea of my every move being monitored without my consent gnawed at me. So I did what any reasonable homeowner would do. I tried to handle it the right way. My first step was an email to the HOA board. I kept it professional, sticking to the facts. I mentioned privacy concerns, asked for clarification on camera placements, and inquired about who had access to the footage. The response? A bland copy-paste reply thanking me for my concern and reassuring me that everything was within community guidelines. That was it. No real answers. No real transparency. Fine. If they wanted to ignore my email, I'd escalate it. I attended the next HOA meeting, ready to have a real conversation. The room was the usual mix of board members and a handful of residents, most of whom stayed quiet during these meetings, letting the board dictate policy without much pushback. When it was my turn to speak, I laid out my concerns: the lack of notification about the camera placements, the invasion of privacy, the fact that my home, my private space, was now under surveillance. The reaction? A mix of irritation and amusement. Mr. Carter, the HOA president, leaned back in his chair with an exasperated sigh. "The cameras are for security," he repeated just as he had before. "We have to take necessary precautions to keep the community safe." I pushed back. "I understand the need for security, but why are cameras aimed at private property? Why weren't homeowners consulted? Who has access to the footage?" He waved a dismissive hand. "You're overthinking this. Nobody's spying on you." A few of the board members chuckled, like I was being ridiculous. Gaslighting at its finest. I glanced around the room, hoping for support. A few homeowners looked uneasy, avoiding my gaze. One older woman shifted in her seat, nodding slightly, but said nothing. That's when I realized others had noticed, but no one wanted to speak up. Maybe they were afraid of retaliation, of fines, of suddenly finding themselves on the wrong side of the HOA's ever-changing rules. Frustrated, I left the meeting with more questions than answers. But if they thought I'd drop it, they were dead wrong. I started digging through HOA bylaws, privacy laws, anything that could give me leverage. And as I went deeper, I found something they weren't expecting. A loophole, a violation, a way to fight back. They had dismissed me as a paranoid homeowner. They had no idea what was coming next. That night, I sat in front of my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating the frustration on my face. If the HOA thought I would just accept their vague excuses, they had seriously underestimated me. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough to start digging in the right places. I started with the HOA bylaws, combing through pages of dense, overly complicated legal jargon. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Rules about property maintenance, noise restrictions, parking regulations. But then, buried deep in a section about common area security measures, I found something interesting. It stated that any surveillance installed by the HOA had to be limited to common areas, parks, walkways, the clubhouse, not private properties. I read it again and again. I wasn't imagining it. Their own bylaws contradicted what they were doing. But I needed more than that. HOA rules weren't the law, and I wanted something stronger. So I started looking into state privacy laws. After what felt like hours of research, I found something that sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. In my state, surveillance laws were clear. Security cameras could not be placed in a way that invaded a resident's reasonable expectation of privacy. That included recording inside a home through windows, direct surveillance of private property, or monitoring areas not considered public. My driveway, my front door, even parts of my backyard that were now within view of those cameras. It was a violation, a clear one. I leaned back in my chair, my heart pounding. This was it, the crack in their armor. They had installed cameras without consent, violated their own bylaws, and now, it seemed, they had broken state law too. A slow grin spread across my face. They had spent weeks dismissing me, treating me like a nuisance, but they had made a mistake. A big one. And now I had something tangible, something that couldn't be brushed aside. This wasn't just about an overreaching HOA anymore. It was about privacy, about rights, about standing up to a group that thought they were untouchable. I had gone from feeling powerless to holding a weapon they didn't even realize I had. The best part? They wouldn't see it coming. The next morning, I wasted no time. I drafted a formal complaint citing both the HOA's own bylaws and the state's privacy laws. I made sure every word was sharp, clear, and impossible to ignore. Then, with a deep breath, I submitted it to the HOA board. I expected resistance. What I didn't expect was outright hostility. A day later, I received an email from the HOA president, a man named Richard Dawson, whose arrogance practically dripped from the screen. He dismissed my complaint outright, claiming the cameras were well within legal bounds and that I was misinterpreting both the bylaws and state law. But that wasn't the worst part. The email ended with a thinly veiled threat. If I continued to stir up unnecessary conflict, I could face fines for disrupting community harmony. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just going to be a simple back and forth. This was a war. I wasn't alone, though. Word spread fast. Other homeowners, ones who had been too hesitant to speak up before, started reaching out. Some had their own concerns. Cameras pointed at their properties. Fines that seemed arbitrary. Rules enforced only when convenient for the board. My case was just the tip of the iceberg. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Local media got involved. A neighbor, frustrated with the HOA for an entirely separate issue, had connections at a local news station. One phone call later, my story was suddenly in the public eye. A reporter reached out asking for an interview. I hesitated at first. This was already bigger than I anticipated. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that exposure was exactly what I needed. The HOA wanted to intimidate me into silence. What they didn't expect was for me to turn up the volume. The news segment aired a week later. It was brutal for the HOA. A legal expert weighed in, confirming that if my claims were accurate, the HOA was likely violating privacy laws. Footage of the cameras, the locations they covered, and interviews with other residents painted a damning picture. And that's when the HOA panicked. The next day, I received another email, this one much more carefully worded. They were reviewing the concerns and would be conducting an internal assessment, but I wasn't going to wait for them to cover their tracks. I hired a lawyer. The formal lawsuit was filed within days. The HOA responded with their own legal team, trying to claim the cameras were a necessary security measure and that my complaint was without merit, but they were scrambling. The case escalated fast, leading to a courtroom showdown that had the entire community watching. HOA board members sat stiffly on one side, their lawyers whispering frantically. My attorney laid everything out, every legal misstep, every violation, every abuse of power. And as the judge listened, his expression unreadable, I knew the moment of reckoning had finally arrived. The decision came down like a hammer, swift, and louder than anyone in that room expected. The HOA had overstepped. The cameras were a violation of privacy laws, a direct breach of the very guidelines they claimed to uphold. The ruling was crystal clear. The cameras had to be removed immediately, and the HOA was slapped with a fine substantial enough to make them feel the weight of their actions. But that wasn't even the most satisfying part. The most satisfying part was watching their confidence crack, their smug certainty evaporate into thin air as reality settled in. They had lost. The board members, once so self-assured, now looked stunned, scrambling for any way to save face. They tried to spin it, of course, talked about misinterpretations and unfortunate oversights. But no one was buying it, not anymore, because for the first time, the community saw them for what they really were. Not protectors of the neighborhood, not enforcers of fairness, but individuals who had wielded authority unchecked for far too long. And now they were exposed. Neighbors who had once been silent started speaking up. Some admitted they had been afraid of retaliation, worried that complaining would put a target on their backs. Others expressed relief, finally able to breathe without the ever-present feeling of being watched. The shift was undeniable. The HOA, once a force that people begrudgingly obeyed, had been reduced to what it should have always been, a group accountable to the people it served, not the other way around. But even with the victory secured, the battle had taken its toll. The months of stress, the countless hours spent researching, the moments of frustration when it felt like the system was designed to wear me down, it all caught up with me. Winning didn't erase the exhaustion. It didn't rewind time and give me back the nights I had spent tossing and turning, questioning if I was in over my head. But it did give me something else. It gave me proof. Proof that standing up, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you, is worth it. Proof that pushing back against injustice isn't just about principle. It's about setting a precedent, making sure no one else has to go through the same fight. And maybe, just maybe, it was about something even bigger than that. Because in that moment, as I watched those cameras being taken down, as I saw the first real shift in how this community viewed authority, I realized something. It wasn't just about winning against the HOA. It was about reminding people that they could win it all, that they weren't powerless, that when something felt wrong, they had every right to challenge it. The aftermath was telling. The HOA, though forced to comply, tried to salvage what little credibility they had left. They introduced new policies, ones that actually required homeowner votes before major security changes. They held open forums, something they had avoided in the past. It was clear they were trying to restore trust, though whether they would ever regain it fully was another matter entirely. As for me, the fight was over, but the lessons stayed. I learned that pushing back is never as easy as simply accepting things the way they are, but it's always worth it. I learned that authority, when left unchecked, will always take more than it should. And I learned that sometimes all it takes to tip the scales is one person refusing to back down. Walking through the neighborhood after everything was said and done, I noticed the difference. The whispered frustrations had turned into open conversations. The cautious glances toward the HOA office had been replaced with an air of confidence. People no longer felt like they had to watch their step. And as for me, I had walked into this fight as someone who just wanted a little privacy. I walked out knowing that I had reclaimed something much bigger, my voice. And that was something no HOA rule could ever take away again. Privacy isn't a luxury, it's a right that can be chipped away piece by piece under the guise of security or community standards, if no one pushes back. This experience taught me that overreach doesn't always come in obvious forms. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, disguised as something reasonable, until one day you wake up and realize you've lost control over something that should have never been up for debate in the first place. Your own home, your own life. I used to think HOAs were just about keeping the grass trimmed and the holiday decorations in check. Now I see them for what they really are. Entities that hold an immense amount of power, often with little oversight. That power can be wielded responsibly, but too often it's abused. And when that happens, the only way to stop it is to fight back. Because if you don't, the rules will keep changing, the control will keep tightening, and one day you'll realize you've given up more than you ever intended. This battle wasn't just about cameras. It was about the principle, about the idea that no authority should be allowed to operate unchecked, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. It was about setting a precedent that homeowners aren't just subjects to be ruled over. They are the very foundation of any community. So if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. Never assume someone else will fight the fight for you. Never assume that just because something has been done a certain way, it's the right way. Because when people stop questioning, stop pushing back, that's when they lose the most. And I, for one, refuse to let that happen again. HOA overreach isn't just my story, it's happening everywhere. Have you ever dealt with an HOA that pushed the limits too far? Maybe they fined you for something ridiculous, or tried to control what you do on your own property. Drop your story in the comments. Your experience might help someone else take a stand. And if you want more eye-opening stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned. There's always more to uncover.